The kitchen floor had already been checked twice when the table moved. A uniformed officer stood with his back to the sink, one hand resting on the counter, the other holding a notepad he had not written on in several minutes. The room was full of people who had come in from the cold and not left. Coats hung on chairbacks. A radio on the counter gave low static between transmissions. Heat came up from the radiator under the window and made the air close. The table sat in the middle of the linoleum with 4 chairs pushed in. It was an ordinary piece of furniture, legs straight, top level. Then the front right leg lifted a quarter inch and set down again. The sound was small, a single wooden knock against the floor. No one at the table had moved. The officer looked down at the leg and stayed where he was. Someone near the doorway shifted their weight, and the boards under their shoes answered. The radio stayed quiet. Outside, more cars had stopped along the curb. Their headlights stayed on for a moment before the engines cut. The table legs stayed on the floor after that. The room held the same number of people it had held before the sound. Nothing else in the kitchen had changed position. The radiator ticked once as the metal cooled and expanded again. A man in a dark jacket stood just inside the doorway with his arms folded. He watched the table without moving closer. Another man, older, kept one hand on the back of a chair as if he meant to pull it out, but did not. The linoleum showed scuff marks from boots that had tracked in street salt. The window over the sink had fogged at the corners from the heat inside. No one spoke. The officer lowered the notepad to his side and kept his eyes on the table legs. A neighbor stepped in from the hallway carrying a flashlight he had not turned on. He set it on the counter next to the radio. The beam rolled once and stopped against the wall. The table remained level. The front right leg stayed flat on the floor. The officer moved his weight from one foot to the other, and the boards under him gave a short creak. Someone outside on the porch stamped their feet against the cold. The sound came through the closed door as a dull thud. The radio crackled once with a distant call number and went silent again. The man in the dark jacket unfolded his arms and let them hang at his sides. He looked at the table, then at the officer, then back at the table. The older man still held the chair. The radiator ticked again, softer this time. The linoleum felt warm under the soles of the boots that had not moved in several minutes. The table did not shift again. The room stayed full. The door to the hallway remained open, and the people standing in it did not step back. Lindley Street in November 1974 ran as a short block of 2-story wood frame houses set close to the sidewalk on both sides. The Gooden residence stood on the north side, a single-family home with aluminum siding that had faded from its original color and a front porch that stretched the full width of the structure. A small yard of patchy grass ended at a chain-link fence. The kitchen sat at the rear of the first floor, its window facing the back fence. The living room opened directly off the front hall. A staircase rose along the right wall just inside the door, its banister worn smooth from use. Upstairs, the bedrooms lined the hallway, the largest one positioned at the front to overlook the street. A basement door was set beneath the stairs on the first floor. The porch carried a single overhead bulb and a simple fixture. During the day, the street saw regular car traffic and foot traffic from neighbors. After dark, it quieted except for the occasional vehicle turning onto the block. The house contained the standard collection of furniture, dishes, lamps, and clothing found in any working household on the street. A kitchen table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the linoleum. An end table in the living room held a lamp and a stack of mail. Beds upstairs were made each morning and left with the covers turned back at night. Nothing in the exterior lines or the interior layout set the address apart from the houses immediately to its left and right. Neighbors passed one another on the sidewalk and recognized the sound of each front door closing. The first shift came from the number of adults who began to enter and remain inside the rooms. Police officers arrived in response to the initial calls and stayed to watch the same spaces they had already checked. Firefighters entered through the front door and the side entrance, their boots leaving marks on the hall floor. Neighbors crossed the yard and stood in the kitchen or living room, their coats draped over chair backs. The house had not been built to hold that many people at once. The radiator under the kitchen window continued to push heat into the air, while the crowd filled the space between the table and the counters. The staircase became a route for repeated trips up and down as people moved between floors to check the bedrooms.
The porch steps collected footprints from boots and shoes that had not been there the week before. The chain link fence at the edge of the yard marked the boundary that the growing group of adults had already crossed.
The first noticeable change came in the kitchen after an ordinary evening meal. A wooden chair that had been tucked squarely under the table stood, pulled back far enough that its front legs rested on the edge of the linoleum. The person who returned to clear the dishes stopped and looked at the gap. They pushed the chair back into place, heard the legs scrape once, and continued with the dishes. When they turned again a few minutes later, the same chair sat several inches out once more. They checked the floor for a slope and found none, then ran a hand along the seat and back as if testing whether the wood had warped. In the living room, a floor lamp with a heavy ceramic base stood on a small braided rug. One night, the base had moved forward until the cord pulled tight against the wall outlet. The lamp shade remained level. Someone unplugged it, carried the whole thing back to its original spot, and plugged it in again. The next time anyone passed through the room, the base had traveled the same distance. The movement left two faint parallel marks in the nap of the rug where the feet had dragged. Cabinet doors in the kitchen began to be found open by the width of a hand. The latches were simple hook and eye fasteners that required a deliberate lift to release. One evening, the lower door beneath the sink stood ajar after the dishes had been put away and the room had been empty for half an hour. The door was closed and the latch dropped into place. Later, the same door sat open again, and the one above it as well. No one had walked through the room in the interval. A low side table between two chairs held a stack of magazines and an ashtray. The table itself slid forward until one leg caught on the edge of the rug and stopped. The magazines stayed stacked. When the table was lifted and set back, the same leg reached the rug again within the hour. The sound was only the short scrape of wood on wood, loud enough to be heard from the next room, but not from upstairs. Thumps came from the direction of the kitchen at intervals. They were single, dull impacts, as if a drawer had been pushed shut from the inside, or a stack of plates had settled. Each time someone entered to look, the room was empty, and nothing appeared displaced except the objects already noted. The adults began to leave a light on over the sink and to walk through both rooms before turning in. They moved the chair back, closed the cabinets, straightened the lamp, and lifted the side table clear of the rug. For a while, the objects stayed where they were left. Then the pattern repeated with the same items or with others nearby. A stack of plates in the drain board dropped lower by one plate, with a single muted clink. The movement was small enough that it could have been caused by the stack settling, except that the plates had already been still for some time. A drawer under the counter opened far enough for the front edge to catch the light from the ceiling fixture. It was closed again and the pull tested. The drawer stayed shut until the next time the room was left alone. These shifts remained within the length of a room or the reach of an arm. No heavy pieces of furniture moved. No doors that had been locked or latched were found open. The adults continued to check the obvious explanations each time. The level of the floor, the condition of the latches, the placement of rugs and cords. They reset the objects and watched them stay in place for longer stretches before the same motions began again. The house stayed otherwise quiet. The street outside carried its usual traffic and then quieted after dark. Inside, the pattern of small, repeated movements continued through several successive evenings. A patrol car pulled to the curb in front of the house after the call came in about objects moving on their own. Two officers stepped out, checked the address on the dispatch card, and walked up the short path to the front door. One carried a flashlight even though it was still daylight. They knocked, waited, and were let inside. The officers stood in the living room while the family described what had happened so far. They asked the usual questions about who was home, whether anyone had been arguing, and if the doors and windows had been left unlocked. Both men wrote the answers in their notebooks before moving through the rooms. They checked the kitchen first. Cabinet doors that were reported open earlier now sat closed. The officers opened each one again, looked inside, and closed them. They tested the latch on the basement door and shined the flashlight down the stairs. Nothing appeared out of place. One officer walked the outside perimeter, checked the foundation for any sign of forced entry, and returned to the car to call in that the exterior was secure. The second officer remained inside and continued writing.
While he stood near the kitchen doorway, a wooden chair at the table slid forward several inches across the linoleum. The movement was steady and stopped on its own. The officer stepped closer, placed his hand on the backrest, and held it there. The chair did not move again.
He called the other officer back inside. Both men examined the floor for any slope or loose section of tile. They checked the legs of the chair and the space beneath the table. In the later accounts of the case, this is the point where the visit stopped sounding like a routine disturbance call. One officer was said to have radioed the station and asked whether another unit could be sent. The second officer stayed by the front door and kept watch on the living room. A small end table near the sofa had shifted since their arrival. Its front leg now rested on the edge of the rug instead of the bare floor. The men compared its position with where they remembered seeing it and kept looking for a practical reason it could have moved. Neighbors across the street had already noticed the patrol car. One man stood on his porch with his arms folded. Two others walked down the sidewalk and stopped at the edge of the property. They asked the officers what was happening. The officers gave no details and asked the men to stay on the public side of the street. A third neighbor crossed anyway and stood near the open front door until one officer directed him back. Within 20 minutes, more people had gathered on the opposite sidewalk. Some carried flashlights, even though the sun had not yet set. A woman wrote down the patrol car number on a piece of paper. The officers completed their basic checks and returned to the car. The street remained quiet for a short while. Then another patrol car arrived and parked in the same spot. The new officers entered the house with the same practical expectation as the first ones. Check the rooms, check the doors, check the people, and see whether the story fell apart under ordinary attention. They positioned themselves in separate rooms and began their own pass through the windows and doors. Outside, the group of neighbors had grown to more than a dozen. Several people stood with their hands in their pockets, watching the open front door and the lights that now burned in every room of the house. One man walked the length of the block and returned with two more residents. The second patrol car remained at the curb with its radio turned low. Additional officers returned on later shifts. They positioned themselves in different rooms and kept the lights on. A sofa in the living room shifted its front edge forward, while two men stood on either side of it. The movement was steady and stopped when it met the edge of the rug. No one had placed a hand on the fabric. A kitchen drawer opened far enough for the silverware inside to be visible, then closed again without sound from the latch. Responders checked the drawer slides and the space beneath the counter. They found no strings, no wires, no mechanism that would produce the motion. The house remained crowded. People stood in doorways and along the walls because there were not enough chairs for everyone present. The floorboards announced each shift of weight. When an object moved, the sound was distinct from the sound of a person walking. Officers kept their flashlights off inside and used the ceiling fixtures instead. They watched the same surfaces for several minutes at a time. The movements continued at irregular intervals. They did not increase in size or speed when more people entered a room, nor did they stop when the room was watched. One officer stood with his back to the kitchen sink, while a small end table in the living room slid 3 inches toward the center of the floor. The table legs made a short scraping sound against the boards. He turned at the noise and saw the table already stopped. Another officer, posted near the front window, noted a stack of magazines on the coffee table lift at one corner and settle again. He stepped closer and pressed his palm flat across the top magazine. The stack stayed level under his hand until he lifted it away. A third responder remained in the hallway between the two rooms and kept his eyes on the sofa. When the front edge moved a second time, the motion began at the left cushion and traveled right, as if something had pressed down and then released. The kitchen drawer opened once more, this time only an inch, then shut. The officer nearest the counter pulled the drawer fully out, examined the rollers, and pushed it back into place. He repeated the action twice. On the third try, the drawer remained closed. Across the room, a dining chair that had been pushed under the table earlier now stood 2 inches farther out. The officer who had checked the drawer walked over and set the chair back in its original spot. He kept one hand on the top rail. The chair did not move again, while his hand stayed there. Space inside the house stayed tight. Responders and household members stood shoulder to shoulder in the narrow passages between furniture. Anyone who needed to cross a room had to turn sideways past those already stationed along the walls. When the sofa shifted again, the front legs traveled the same short distance as before and stopped at the rug. The two officers on either side of it had not changed position. One of them knelt and looked beneath the frame. He saw only the carpet and the wooden legs. He stood and stepped back to the wall. A lamp on a side table near the doorway rocked once on its base, without tipping. The officer posted at that doorway reached out and steadied the shade with 2 fingers. The lamp settled. He removed his hand. The base remained still. In the kitchen, the silverware drawer opened a third time, far enough for the handles to catch the light, then closed without catching. The responder who had examined the slides earlier watched the drawer from 3 feet away. He noted the time on his notepad and waited. 2 minutes later, the same drawer repeated the motion. The officers continued to change positions every 20 minutes. One man moved from the living room doorway to the kitchen threshold. Another took his place. They kept the overhead lights burning and avoided casting shadows across the main floor surfaces. Each new shift brought the same sequence: an object displaced by a few inches, a pause, then another displacement elsewhere in the room. The movements never occurred at the same moment. Two responders were looking directly at the same piece of furniture. They occurred often enough that the officers could track the pattern of which surfaces had already moved and which had not. The sofa advanced once more, this time stopping just short of the rug. The end table in the living room repeated its earlier slide. The stack of magazines lifted at the corner and dropped. Each time an officer checked the object afterward, the surface showed no obvious marks, residue, or attached material that could explain the motion. The drawer in the kitchen continued its partial openings at uneven intervals. Later retellings described the officers trying to keep track of which object had moved, where it had started, and who had been standing nearby. The activity remained inside the same set of household items and continued at the same modest scale. Fire department personnel arrived after additional calls reported objects shifting without anyone near them. They parked their apparatus at the curb and entered through the front door carrying the standard equipment for a structure check. Inside, they moved room by room, testing light switches, opening closet doors, and confirming the location of the main water shutoff and electrical panel. While two firefighters stood in the living room, a framed picture on the wall opposite the sofa tilted on its hook. The lower right corner dropped several inches until the frame hung at an angle. One firefighter stepped onto a kitchen chair, straightened the frame, and stepped down again. The picture stayed level for the next several minutes while they finished their walkthrough. Outside, the number of vehicles along the street had increased. Additional patrol cars had taken positions at each end of the block, and civilian cars now lined both curbs. Neighbors stood on their porches and on the sidewalk directly in front of the house. Some carried folding chairs or blankets and remained in place as dusk settled. The low sound of idling engines mixed with occasional radio traffic from the patrol units. People at the back of the gathering asked those closer to the windows what had been seen. The answers passed along the line in short phrases. A drawer had opened, a chair had moved, nothing had been touched by hand. Inside, the responders continued their inspection. They checked the kitchen cabinets, examined the tracks on the silverware drawer, and looked beneath the sink for any visible connections. A second framed photograph in the hallway tilted while they watched, then settled again without falling. One firefighter remained near the front door to keep the entry clear. Through the open doorway, the growing line of headlights could be seen reflecting off the windshields of parked cars. The crowd had begun to spill into the street itself, forcing arriving vehicles to slow and edge around groups of people standing in the roadway. The firefighters completed their check and returned to their apparatus. They left the house with the same equipment they had carried in. The crowd did not disperse. New arrivals continued to stop along the curb through the evening, some parking several houses away and walking the remaining distance. People on the sidewalk compared notes on what they had heard from those who had been closer to the windows earlier. The same descriptions circulated. Furniture had shifted, drawers had opened, no one had been near the objects at the time. The street remained occupied after the fire department units had departed, with the sound of conversation and idling engines carrying into the night. The household included a young girl, whose presence became attached to the public version of the case. Adults in and around the house later described the activity as seeming to follow the rooms she had recently left or was about to enter. That did not make her the cause, and it did not give anyone the right to turn a child into the villain of the story. In the careful version, she stays at the edge of the scene while the adults keep checking rooms, surfaces, and sightlines. When she sat in the living room, the movements were said to continue in the kitchen. When she moved upstairs, sounds were said to come from rooms below. The attention should stay on the rooms themselves and on the repeated need to check the same surfaces after each shift. Firefighters already inside the house continued their room-by-room check after the picture frame tilted and settled. One of them remained near the front hallway, while another stood at the base of the stairs. The girl moved through the first-floor rooms under adult attention, while the responders tried to keep their focus on doors, furniture, and the narrow lines of sight through the house. A later version of the story places another small movement on the upstairs landing while adults were watching the stairs from below. Whether that memory came from a clear view or from the confusion of a crowded house became part of the problem. Every account after that had to pass through the same cramped rooms, the same anxious adults, and the same public pressure outside. Outside, the crowd had grown enough that additional patrol cars were positioned at the intersection to keep the street open. Neighbors who had been watching the windows described the same sequence to one another. The girl would leave a room, and within a minute or two, an object in another room would change position. No one claimed to have seen the motion begin while she was still inside that room. The pattern held through the evening. When the girl walked into the dining area, a lamp on a side table in the living room shifted several inches toward the edge. When she returned to the couch, a drawer in the kitchen opened partway and remained open until an adult closed it. The adults present kept the girl in the same general area rather than sending her to investigate any of the shifts. Later that night, the same sequence was said to repeat with police officers, who had arrived after the firefighters left. One officer stood in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, while the girl remained in the living room with adults nearby. A ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter was later described as having moved forward until its edge touched the backsplash. The officer stepped into the kitchen to examine the bowl, then looked back toward the living room. The important part of the memory is not that it proves anything, it is that the adults inside kept trying to separate what they saw from who happened to be near the room. The following morning, the pattern was described again to additional adults who had not been present the night before. The girl moved through the first-floor rooms at her usual pace, while observers checked the surfaces around her path. A chair in the dining area was said to have been pulled out from the table. A framed photograph on a shelf in the hallway was said to have sat at an angle. The adults compared memories of where people had been standing and which rooms had been watched. They kept trying to arrange watchers in each room, but the house was too small and too crowded for anyone to pretend every angle had been sealed. In the days after the first responders left, adults from outside the household began to take shifts inside the Lindley Street address. Police officers returned in pairs during evening hours, along with firefighters who had answered earlier calls. They entered through the front door, removed their coats, and moved through the rooms one at a time. Each man checked the latches on the windows, tested the sashes to see whether they slid freely, and noted whether any panes showed fresh cracks. Furniture was pulled several inches from the walls, so the space behind a sofa or bureau could be seen without obstruction. Doorways were left open and kept clear of coats or bags, so no one's line of sight would be blocked. Observers stood or sat at fixed points. One man remained near the kitchen doorway, another near the base of the stairs. A third took a chair in the living room with a view of the table and the sideboard. When a lamp was said to shift across the table surface, the nearest watcher tried to remember exactly where it had been before. The same informal process followed a chair that scraped forward on the linoleum or a framed picture that tilted on its hook. At the end of a watch period, the adults compared what they believed they had seen. One person might say the lamp moved while his back was turned for less than a minute. Another would answer that he had kept the table in view the entire time and noticed nothing until the sound drew his attention. As word spread, more adults arrived. Neighbors parked along the curb and carried thermoses of coffee into the house. Some stayed for 2-hour periods, others for only 20 minutes before returning to their own homes. The front room grew crowded enough that people had to stand against the walls to leave walking space clear. A firefighter stationed himself at the top of the stairs while another remained at the bottom, each watching the steps between them. When a sound came from the kitchen, both men moved at once, meeting in the doorway and comparing what each had heard. One described a scraping noise that lasted several seconds,
The other reported only a single sharp tap.
The more people gathered, the more the accounts diverged. Two men watching the same sideboard from different angles could disagree on whether the picture frame had moved before or after the sound of footsteps on the porch outside. A third person seated on the sofa might remember the frame tilting gradually, while the man nearest the window remembered it as sudden. Those differences did not automatically erase the story, but they changed its shape. The house had become a room full of memories being made at the same time, not a sealed laboratory where every object had one clean witness. The house itself showed no change in its structure. The floors stayed level under repeated checks with a carpenter's level. Doors that had been closed at the start of a shift remained closed, unless someone passed through them. The activity stayed limited to short movements of ordinary objects. A salt shaker sliding across the counter, a stack of magazines settling on the floor, a curtain lifting slightly at one corner before falling back. The girl remained in view of at least two adults whenever she was in a room where motion occurred, yet the watchers continued to focus on the surfaces and the open sight lines rather than on any single person. Outside, the line of parked cars lengthened after dark. Some drivers remained in their vehicles with the windows down, listening for sounds from the house. Others entered in small groups, waited their turn near the doorway, and left again without speaking to those already inside. The pattern of watches continued through the nights that followed, with the same furniture moved away from the walls each evening and the same doorways kept clear. After the gatherings thinned, accounts of the nights differed in detail. Adults who had stood in the living room described a chair sliding several inches across the floor while no one stood within reach of it. Others who had remained in the same room at the same time recalled only the slight settling of the floorboards under the weight of people shifting their stance. In the kitchen, one observer noted a small metal canister moving along the counter after the group had stepped back to clear sight lines. A second observer in the same space recorded the canister staying still and attributed any change to the vibration from someone closing the back door moments earlier. The rotating group of adults kept the same rough procedures each evening. Furniture stayed pulled away from the walls, doorways remained open and unobstructed. Windows were latched and checked at the start of each watch. When an object was said to move, the nearest person tried to remember the starting position and who had been in the way. Disagreements appeared over whether a particular shift had been seen from a clear angle or whether another person's body had blocked part of the view for a few seconds. No one present kept a continuous written log signed by every adult who entered. Outside, the line of cars along the curb grew and shrank with each new arrival. Neighbors stood on the sidewalk or sat in their own vehicles with the windows down. Some brought flashlights and aimed the beams through the front windows when the interior lights were on. Others left after an hour and returned the next night with different companions. Each new group asked what had already been seen that evening. The answers they received depended on which room the previous watchers had occupied and which movements they had chosen to record. Photographs taken during those nights showed the exterior of the house, the parked cars, and groups of people on the sidewalk. None captured an object in motion. The images that circulated later were made after the fact, when the rooms had already been rearranged for easier viewing. No film or video record was made inside the house during the periods when the largest number of people were present. Skeptical accounts later pointed to the repeated opening and closing of doors each time a new person entered or left. With that many adults moving through the small rooms, small shifts in furniture could occur without anyone intending them. The excitement of standing watch for hours could also make ordinary settling or a slight tilt of the floor underfoot seem larger than it was. Memory of the exact sequence of events became harder to hold when several people spoke at once about what they had just seen. Local reporting carried both the descriptions of unexplained movement and the notes of those who found ordinary causes for the same events. No single document collected every observation from every person who had stood inside. Years afterward, assembled retellings placed greater weight on the presence of police officers and firefighters who had entered the house. Those retellings drew from the separate recollections of the adults who had taken turns on the watches, and from the neighbors who had remained on the street. The original sheets of paper listing times and distances were not preserved as a single set. The household remained in the residence after the cars stopped lining the curb. The pattern of small movements continued for a time inside the same rooms and then became less frequent. After the last of the marked cars pulled away, the street settled into its usual pattern of evening traffic. A single set of headlights moved past the corner and continued on toward the next block. The house itself showed no outward change. Its siding remained the same faded color, the front steps still held the same slight dip in the middle tread, and the mailbox stayed fastened to the post beside the walk. Inside, the furniture had been returned to the positions it occupied before the watches began. The sofa sat against the far wall of the living room. The two armchairs faced the window at the angle they had held through the earlier weeks. The coffee table stood centered between them, with its stack of magazines squared at the corner. In the kitchen, the table rested level on all four legs. The chairs were pushed in. The dishes from the last meal had been washed and placed in the drainer beside the sink. The radiator under the window continued its low ticking as the furnace cycled on and off. No new scratches appeared on the floorboards. The rugs lay flat where they had been straightened after the final group departed. A lamp in the hallway remained lit until someone switched it off from the base. The rooms then held only the ordinary arrangement of lamps, chairs, and rugs that had been there before the attention arrived. Outside, the porch light stayed on for another hour. One neighbor walked past on the sidewalk, glanced once at the front windows, and kept moving. Another car slowed at the intersection, then continued without stopping. The sound of tires on pavement returned to its regular spacing. Inside the house, the only remaining sounds were the furnace fan and the occasional creak of the floorboards under normal weight. The windows stayed closed, the curtains hung straight. When the last light was turned off, the rooms held the same shadows they had held on any other night before the gatherings began. A police radio on the kitchen counter, left behind during the final check, emitted a brief burst of static and then went silent. The house stood as one more residence on the block. Its windows showed no movement. The street outside carried only the sound of passing vehicles, and the low hum of the street light at the corner. The public attention had moved on, yet the rooms retained the same layout and the same ordinary stillness they had possessed before the watches started.